Hello, everybody. Welcome to McLean Uncorked, produced by the McLean Community Center for our first ever virtual wine tasting event. Of course, this event was supposed to be held in person, like so many things this year, but we're excited that even with this year's challenges, we're able to connect with you and share these great wines and lots of great facts about them together. So we'd like to thank Istrico Productions team and Chainbridge Cellars of McLean for helping to make this event happen. If you'd like to learn more about this event or about future events put on by the McLean Community Center, you can visit the website at mcleancenter.org/special-events for that information. So now I'd like to bring on Doug House, our wine expert for this evening. Hi, Doug.
Hello. Shall we dive in?
Good. Let's do it.
All right, everybody. As Julie said, I'm Doug House, and I am the co-owner and ringleader here at Chainbridge Cellars. Here at the shop, the number one thing that we try to do is help wine drinkers, people like you, find and take home wines that you're delighted to be drinking. And we go about that in a lot of ways, but a big one is asking people questions so that we can learn what it is people like in wine. The problem with that is it can be hard to figure out exactly why we like wine in the first place, much less put that to words, much less put it to words that other people can understand. So we're going to try to address that issue as we go through the wines tonight. I've pulled out 8 characteristics of wine that we find most determine whether or not somebody really, really likes the wine. And tonight, what we're going to do is talk through all of those 8 and give you a chance to play around with them and see how somebody like me might talk about them. As we go through them, you're going to notice that we'll spend more time talking about how wine feels in your mouth and what it makes happen physiologically in your mouth than we will be talking about cherries versus raspberries or chocolate or vanilla or butter or all of those kind of flavor things. It's not that flavor doesn't matter, but that we find that flavor is less reliable in figuring out what people are really going to love than some of the structural and textural elements of wine. So we're going to really focus on that as we go through all the wines tonight. If everything works, by the time we're done, you'll have learned a little bit more about how to talk about wine and how to talk to people like me or Sam in a restaurant and tell them more about what you want and get a better hit rate in terms of winners from folks like us. But at a minimum, we'll have a little fun and we'll get to taste some good juice as we go through the night and have a little conversation during the breaks. So before we do anything else, actually, well, Julie mentioned we are going to be taking questions, so you can add those. We'll take at least 2 breaks for those as we go through. So there'll be time to have a little dialogue as we move along. So before we actually dig into the wines and the content there, I just want to talk a little bit about tasting wine versus drinking wine and tasting wine for purposes of understanding it. And you can do me a favor at home right now. If you will just look at that first glass of wine, but don't pick it up, and just lean your head down to it and give it a big sniff and notice what it is you smell. So it's going to be just a little bit most likely. If you pick that glass up and or on the table, you can do this as well, and give it a little swirl like this, and then stick your nose back in again, you'll notice you smell a lot more. What's happened is when you swirl the wine, you've really dramatically increased the surface area of the wine. With more surface area, there's more evaporation, and evaporation is what brings all those aromas out of the wine and into your nose and into your head. We're not going to talk a ton about aroma in wine, but it's important to understand that phenomenon so that you can understand what happens when we taste. So what I want you to do now is take the 4th wine and just take a sip and swallow it or spit it out or whatever you're going to do, just like you were at a dinner party. So just grab it and take a sip and a swallow and kind of notice how you experience that wine. So now what I'm going to want you to do is take another sip, but this time what I'm going to want you to do is to really slosh it around your mouth and kind of chew on it a little bit and maybe even like pull some air in through it. So watch, it looks sort of like this. And then you can spit like I'm doing, or you can swallow as you go along. Really get it swirled around, get a little air through it, and notice how much more you experience the wine. Yes, you'll taste more flavors because you've aerated the wine and have now evaporated. All those flavor compounds have evaporated and are going up into your nose where you taste, but you also feel the wine a lot more. That's the best way to go about tasting wines in a setting like this where we're trying to understand them and get an idea of how we're going to react to them when we're actually drinking them. when you go to a dinner party or you're with friends at a cocktail party, you don't normally drink wine like that. I will confess, I sometimes forget and do it, but it's not really what you want to do. So you're not going to have the same exact experience when you first taste a wine at a party or just casually as you're going to have when we do this. But over the course of an evening, as you drink that wine, gradually all of those flavors and all of those textures build, and you will end up experiencing all the things that we experience when we do tasting like this, just over like 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So this is a chance to have all of that experience right at once where we can focus on it and learn about it a little bit. All right, so that's how I'm hoping that we'll actually taste the wines as we go through tonight. So what I'm going to want you to do is I'm going to want you to taste the first pair, and everybody should have a copy of a sheet that looks like this in front of you. So that sheet we emailed out to you. It has on it each of the two white wines at the top. It has the label for the Bourgogne Blanc on the left and for the Heron on the right. And it lists down the middle 4 characteristics of the wines that we're going to talk about tonight. So what I want you to do is taste the first wine and the second wine.
Doug, can I break in real quick?
Yeah.
I think some of the people are missing that list. So if you could just run really quickly, which wine goes in which order?
Sure. So our list tonight is we're going to taste the Romo. It's actually, if you got a tasting sheet, it's the same order as on the tasting sheet. So our tasting map. So we're going to do the Romo Petit first. Then we're going to do the Heron Chardonnay. So those are our first 2 wines. The second pair of wines, we're going to do the Hocasan Bordeaux first, and then the Andaluna Reyes Malbec second. So we're going to start with just the first 2 white wines. And what we're going to ask you to do is taste both of them and just think about which one you like better. And then we're going to ask you to go down the list of descriptors we put on here. And those descriptors are more ripe, heavier or more weight, more acidity, and then more forward or less long. And what we're going to ask you to do is we're going to ask you to think about which one you'd put a plus by for being more ripe, heavier, more acidic, or more forward, and a minus by the other one. So you'll have circled each of your wines based on preference, and you'll have marked which one is more or less of each of those 4 characteristics. And that's what we're going to talk through as we go on through this. So just start by going back and forth through the wines a couple of times and kind of get your head around which one you like. And then just go down that list using whatever you understand those words to mean. We're going to talk about what they mean in the wine world in a little bit here, and just kind of get a sense for which you like and kind of how you see them matching up on those pairs. While you're doing that first tasting and figuring that out, let me just tell you a little bit about the 2 wines so you know what they are. Both of our first 2 wines are 100% Chardonnay. They were both picked by hand. Both of them had the grapes come to the winery and they were pressed, so all the juice was removed from the skins right away. They both were put into stainless steel tanks where they fermented, and then they were racked into other stainless steel tanks where they aged until it was time to bottle them. So neither of these wines has seen the inside of a barrel. There's no oak influence on either of these wines. The first wine on your left, or on the first of the wines on the tasting sheet, is what we call a white Burgundy, which is just another way of saying it is a 100% Chardonnay from Burgundy, France. If you pick up the bottle and you look at the label, you'll notice that it says Bourgogne, and then under it in quotes is Chardonnay. That's a cheat for Americans who don't always know that Bourgogne Blanc, if it's white in Bourgogne, it has to be Chardonnay. So it's 100% Chardonnay. It was grown by a guy named Romuald Petit. He's about 40 years old, and he inherited all of his vineyards from his parents and grandparents down in the southern part of Burgundy, France, in a region called the Macon. The Macon tends to give wines that are a little rounder and richer and easier than you'll find further north in the Côte d'Or, but also much less expensive, which is one of the things we like about them. Some of his vines are as old as 100 years old. Some are as young as 10. The average age of vines in this particular wine is around 35 years. So fairly old vines, very carefully tended, harvested, pressed into wine, no oak, just a really pretty example of white Burgundy. The second wine is from a woman by the name of Lily Heron. And if you've ever met Lily, and I've met her a couple of times, when she starts talking, you find yourself sort of leaning back like this because she's a very intense personality. Lily grew up mainly in North Africa. Her father was a mining engineer and spent a lot of time in Europe as a child, came back to the US when she got out of college, went back to Europe and opened a wine importation business in Denmark, of all places. From there, made some friends in France and ended up starting what's called a négociant business in France, buying sort of young or unmade wine from different producers and blending it and then exporting it to the United States. Eventually came back to the United States and started this current label called Heron, after her last name, to make good value wines from across California. The wine we're tasting tonight is 100% Chardonnay, again, from the Mendocino County area in California, from a vineyard called Potter Vineyard, about 5 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean. So it's cool for California, even though it's still a fairly warm, sunny kind of site. So 2 wines, both really good examples of Chardonnay from their respective places. So I hope by now everybody's picked a favorite between the 2, and you've had a chance to kind of walk down the scorecard. So let's kind of walk down it together a little bit. So our first question is, which of these 2 wines is more ripe? And like so many things in wine, the answer is a little complex because words can mean more than one thing, because there are actually at least 3 different things we mean when we talk about ripeness. The first thing we worry about in ripeness is talking about sugar ripeness. And when we talk about sugar ripeness, we're basically asking, as the grape has matured and sugar levels have risen, acid levels decline. And a grape is considered sugar ripe when the acid and the sugar are balanced so that there will be enough alcohol produced in fermentation to balance the acidity and enough acidity left to balance kind of the weight and oily feel of the alcohol. Both of these wines are really acceptably sugar ripe. There's no problem in sugar ripeness there. The second kind of ripeness we like to talk about is called phenolic ripeness, which is just a fancy way of saying how ripe are the skins and the seeds. Grapevines do a funny thing. They have 2 reproductive strategies. One is to keep growing vine, but the other is to make fruit with seeds inside of it that animals will eat and carry around in their bellies and then eventually deposit in a field somewhere in a little pile of fertilizer so the seed can start growing. The problem is that seed isn't really ready right away to be deposited and grown. So grapevine's strategy is, until that seed is ready, to lace the seed itself and the skins with a bunch of bitter chemicals that we call phenols. So those phenols sort of make the grape unappetizing until it's ripe. As the grape ripens and the seed gets ready to actually grow, those phenolics begin to decline and they become less and less of them and they become less bitter. So a grape that has resolved most of those bitter compounds in the skin and seed is called phenolically ripe. It won't bring a lot of bitterness into the wine. Usually that's identified with whenever the seed turns brown. Normally when the seed's brown, it's all the way phenolically ripe. Both of these wines are phenolically ripe, although I think the Bourgogne may be a smidge more phenolically ripe than the Heron Chard, but they're both plenty phenolically ripe. Neither of those is the kind of ripeness I want you to worry about. The kind of ripeness I want you to worry about is the ripeness that's expressed in what we call fruit character. So I want you to think about a wine of low ripeness in fruit character is one that represents kind of early season fruits. So like a raspberry maybe picked a week early, or a strawberry picked a couple of weeks early, or tangy fruits, or like sort of tart citrus flavors. Those are all low ripeness flavors. As we move up the ripeness spectrum, those fruits move into kind of midsummer season. So you start seeing ripeness that expresses as a really ripe, juicy strawberry, or a yellow apple that's kind of like a Honey Crisp apple that's sort of giving you a lot more sweetness than a Granny Smith apple will. And as you continue along the ripeness category, you start to get things like super hot climate fruits, like tropical fruits like papaya and mango and really ripe pineapple. So there's a spectrum of fruit ripeness that runs from tangy and fresh to generously ripe to super ripe. And if they get really, really ripe, you can even start to get the flavor of cooked fruit like jam. If you hear people talk about jammy fruit, that's what they're talking about. So with these 2 wines, which one is more ripe in terms of flavor? I think it's pretty obvious that the Heron Chardonnay has a riper flavor profile. You're going to get a little bit of maybe golden apple compared to the green Granny Smith apple in the Bourgogne Blanc. The Bourgogne Blanc shows a little bit of like lime zest citrus kind of character. The Heron shows a little bit of pineapple, maybe even a little bit of mango sort of flavor to it. It's the warmer, riper flavors that you're getting in that wine. If you preferred the Heron, that probably means that you prefer those riper, more generous, higher levels of fruit ripeness in wine. If you prefer the Bourgogne Blanc, it probably means, or it suggests at least, that you prefer those kind of greener, crisper, less ripe flavors. Neither's right and neither's wrong, but understanding where you are on that spectrum gives us a huge insight into the kind of wines you're going to like. All right. So the second thing that really drives people's flavor or wine preference, in addition to sort of fruit character, is weight, how the wine actually feels in its mouth. And this one can be a little tricky to figure out, especially in this pair. So I'm going to give you an idea about how to think about weight and ask you to retaste the two wines and see what you think. Think about weight in wine as on a spectrum where on one end we have water. So think about water being very light and fresh, and then think of skim milk, and then think of whole milk, and then think of cream. So that's the spectrum of weight between our body, between water and skim milk, going higher with whole milk, and then all the way to cream. Taste these two wines again and try not to pay attention to anything other than how they feel. Just think about how they actually sit on your palate. Does it become a little more obvious which one is the weightier of the two? I think a lot of people are going to struggle not to say the Heron is riper because it has a lot of the flavors that we find in riper, more alcoholic wines. But the Heron is actually just 13% alcohol. The Bourgogne Blanc, which tastes less ripe, is actually much more full in body at a full 14.1% alcohol. Why am I talking about alcohol in terms of body and weight? Because alcohol really is the perception of weight in wine. Technically, it's what makes a wine feel weighty. The more alcohol a wine it has, the more heavy we would say it is, or the heavier it is, the lighter it's going to be. Again, part of the problem here is that the Heron, it has those super ripe flavors that normally go with lots of sugar development and flavor development, and that means it's going to have more alcohol, where the Bourgogne Blanc feels more like a cool climate wine with all those sort of tart green flavors. What happened is something a little odd happened in vintage 2019 in Burgundy. Normally, in a normal vintage, the Romo Petit Bourgogne Blanc would be harvested at something like 12.8 to 13.2% alcohol, potential alcohol. So if you fermented out the sugar in the wine, you would end up with about 13% alcohol normally. In 2019, when these grapes were harvested, if you measured the sugar in the grapes, just the total sugar in each grape, it was about the same amount of sugar as you would find in a year when the grape only made 13% alcohol. The difference is that 2019 in Burgundy was incredibly dry. And so the grapes had the same amount of sugar, but in 19, the grapes were much smaller because they have much less water in them. And so if you think about it, when we talk about alcohol as a percentage of what's in the wine, the other thing that's in the wine besides alcohol is water. So what happened in 2019 was the Romo Petit ended up with more alcohol by percentage than it normally would have because it had much less water in it. Still, as you taste these two wines, if after you've thought about it, you tend to prefer the Heron, that suggests that maybe a lighter textured wine could be interesting to you. If you prefer the Romo Petit, and I think if you would prefer heavier wines as you drank it over the course of a meal, you would increasingly find yourself drawn to that kind of substance that it has. So it's a little bit of a heavier wine. All right, next, let's talk about acidity, which along with weight is one of the three things that most influence how much people really like wine. Everybody knows what acid is. If you think about just putting your tongue on a lemon, you can think about what acid feels like on your tongue. In wine, we think about acid as being one of the two things that really makes your mouth water and makes your mouth salivate. So if you retaste the two wines now, I think you'll notice that one of them makes your mouth water more and salivate more. All wine is pretty acidic. It's a fairly acidic beverage, which is one of the reasons why it lasts. The acid is an antioxidant and an antibacterial, so it helps the wine not spoil over time. Some wines, even with the same level of acids, you'll find that one of them tastes more acidic than the other, even if technically they have the same acid levels. And that's just because one of them may have more things in it that buffer the acid, like alcohol or even residual sugar. So with these two wines, I think it's actually pretty easy to tell which one's the more acidic. The Heron is very gentle and round on your palate, where the Romo Petit is definitely more mouth-watering and more crisp. So it's really, really, I think, got that mouth-watering character. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about with the two white wines is going to kind of wander into geeky territory a little bit. We're going to talk about length, but we're not going to talk about length of finish, which is what most people think about when they hear length. They think, how long do the flavors last in your mouth? Actually, we're going to talk about palate length because palate length versus forward is one of the things that really drives preference in wine. A wine that's forward sort of gives up all of its flavor right as it goes into your mouth and kind of used up all that energy. It then doesn't push all the flavors back. A long wine really drives its flavors from the front of your palate all the way to the back of your palate. It's not as dramatic on entry, but it's more sustained in how you experience on the palate. I think with tasting these two wines, again, it's pretty obvious which one is forward. The Heron is explosive right on the palate, and then it kind of tails off in a mellow, gentle way. Well, the Roma Petit really drives its flavors right from the tip of your tongue all the way back to your gullet in a way that's really compelling. If you talk to wine geeks and wine pros, there are some who will say a forward wine is never as good as a wine that's long, but I think that's not true. I think some people like that big dramatic burst of flavor and don't care about how far it sustains, and other people really like the experience of a wine that sustains back. Whichever one you prefer is absolutely fine, but this is how the difference in the two tastes. So that's my kind of walk through the first flight of wines and the four characteristics that seemed important with those. Are there questions?
Doug, that was so interesting. So first I want to ask you, we've all heard of oaked and unoaked Chardonnays, and I think it's so interesting that you gave us two unoaked Chardonnays to taste. Can you talk about, why some are oaked and how that would be different?
I certainly can, but this is like one of those, but wait, I'll get there. We're going to talk about oak more when we talk about these two wines, about the two red wines. But basically, oak shapes the texture of Chardonnay and adds certain kinds of flavors. And when you have an oaked wine, it can make it harder to taste the things I wanted to talk about here. So in this particular case, I chose them just because it made the things stand out. Oaking of a Chardonnay is neither a good thing or a bad thing. It's all about how it all comes together. But if I can, I'll just hold off on talking about the details of oak until we're on the red wines.
Absolutely. Okay, now given also that these are somewhat similar wines, but you did a wonderful job of really highlighting how they are different. They might go with similar foods, but if you wanted to pair these with the ideal food for each, how would you go for each of these?
Sure, the Heron wants a richer, kind of a fattier sort of pairing. So scallops with some brown butter would be really good with the Heron, or lobster would be really good with it. Shrimp might be a little too iodine-y. Like a roast chicken that was really savory and caramelized. All those kinds of flavors I think would be really nice with the Heron. The Roma Petit, because the acid levels are higher and the wine's a little more subtle in flavor, is going to want to match up with things that maybe are a little more subtle. So a nice piece of flounder. Also, I think fried fish would be really good with the Roma Petit because it has the acid to cut through the fattiness that you would find in a fried dish. Both of them would be pretty good with cheeses, although the Roma Petit will be happier with stronger cheeses, and the Heron would want more kind of mild or mellow cheeses to go with.
Okay, now the next question I have is both of these wines are made fairly recently. One is 2018 and one is 2019. So are they ready to drink now, or would it be more ideal to keep them?
That's a great question. The Heron, both of these wines are absolutely ready right now. And ready, if you think about it, just means the wine is giving most of what it will ever give. And I think both of these wines are expressive and they're open and they're easy to drink right now. Both of them will improve, I think, over the next 12 months. And then after that, the Heron will hold on for maybe another 2 or 3 years for one key reason. It doesn't really have the acid or stuffing to hold on for a long time. But what the Heron has is this. It's a screw top. And screw tops are wonderful closures for protecting wine from oxygen. So I would guess that the Heron will still be pretty tasty if you keep it cool and out of light for 3 years, 4 years maybe. The Roma Petit will actually, I think, improve for maybe even another 24 months and would probably hold for 3 or 4 years after that because the acid levels are higher and it's more concentrated. The acid levels slow the oxidation of the wine, the stuff that makes the flavors decay. And that weight means there's room for other flavors to develop as it ages. But both of them are yummy right now. And I don't know that I would buy either one of them to lay them down. I'd buy them to drink. And then if I forgot a bottle for a couple of years, I wouldn't worry about it.
It's interesting you mentioned the screw top because that was my next question. And you said that the one with the screw top will actually hold longer.
Yes.
There's been more wines coming out with screw tops, but of course, cork is traditional and it's kind of fun to actually, uncork it and everything with the corkscrew. What's the difference?
And if I had a preference, if the world conformed itself to my wishes, any wine that did not have a history of improving for 10 to 15 years would be finished under screw top. It would have a screw top closure. The beauty of screw top closures is if there's a problem with the closure, you know it when you take the wine out of the box because it will have leaked. Otherwise, you have a good intact closure. Oxygen is kept away from the wine and it enables the wine to develop at its slowest, but also its best way. Also, screw tops don't have any taint. Corks have two problems. One problem is they can leak. The cork can fail. They're not all perfect. But there's also a problem with a certain chemical that is found in cork forests. If it's exposed to chlorine, produces another chemical called TCA. And don't ask me to tell you what TCA stands for. If you've ever heard anybody talk about a wine that was corked, they weren't talking about pieces of cork floating around in the wine or the cork being crumbly. What we're talking about is the presence of that TCA compound, and it makes the wine smell a little moldy or like wet newspapers or old cardboard, and it kills the fruit in wine. There are few things more frustrating than buying a good bottle of wine and laying it down and pulling the cork 10 years later and finding out then that the cork failed and oxygen's gotten in the wine and the wine is spoiled, or even worse, getting that terrible, terrible TCA cardboard smell, meaning that the wine just isn't right. And the real problem with cork is when TCA levels are really, really, really low, you don't smell the cardboard, you just don't have enough fruit in the wine. So sometimes we will sell wine to somebody and they'll say, oh, I didn't really think that was very good. It was kind of boring. And we'll know almost immediately that there was a cork failure and swap the bottle out. And almost always they taste a good bottle and go, oh, that's why you told me to drink it. So with wines that are proven to age 10, 15, 20 years that have a historical track record, the problem is that things age differently under screw top than they do under cork. And so if you give up cork with those wines, you're making a break from what people's expectations are and what people's sort of experience have been with the wines. And it can be harder to know what's going to actually play out. But yeah, I think most wines should be finished under screw top, and it means you don't have to look for the corkscrew every time you want it, and you don't have to buy a special funny thing to put back on the bottle when you put it back in the fridge.
Okay, Doug, I think we're going to move on to the reds. So if you'll start that out just by explaining those two, what they are, and we'll
sure. All right, great. We're ready. Off we go. So our two red wines. So the first of the two red wines is the Haut-Cassin Bordeaux, and the second is the Andaluna Malbec Races. And what I'm going to ask you to do is the same thing you did with the two whites. So what I want you to do is to taste both of them and go back and forth and just figure out, first of all, which one you like the best. And if you have our sheet, circle that. And then after you've done that, I want you to kind of say which one is higher and which one is lower on 4 dimensions. One is more fruity, which is the fruitier of the two wines. Second, which is the oakier of the two wines, so we can talk about oak. Third, which is the more tannic of the two wines, and we'll talk about tannin some more. And finally, which of the two wines feels more complex, which has more complexity. So you're going to taste them, figure out which one you like, and then try to rate them on fruitiness, oakiness, tannin levels, and complexity. Okay, that's your job. And so now I'll tell you about the two wines. So the Fleur Haut-Cassin is a pretty classic red Bordeaux, so it's from Bordeaux, France, and it's a blend. It's 85% Merlot and 10% Cabernet, a mixture of Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon, and about 5% Malbec. It's from vintage 2016, which is a certifiably great vintage in Bordeaux. There's a lot of hype around vintage in a lot of places, especially in Bordeaux, but 2016 is really the bomb, okay? It's a great year. And what a great year in Bordeaux really means is that a whole lot of people made really good wine. What a bad year means is that almost nobody made really good wine and some people made really terrible wine. And that's all that whole great year, not great year thing really means. The second wine is the Andaluna Malbec Races, which is 100% Malbec from fairly low for Argentina vineyards at about 700 meters. You'll notice that the Bordeaux had 5% Malbec in it, and the Andaluna is 100% Malbec. So where did that Malbec in Argentina come from? It came from Bordeaux. Immigrants to Argentina from France in the late 19th century brought with them cuttings from the place they came. A lot of people moved from Bordeaux to Argentina in the late 1800s, fleeing the ravages of what was called phylloxera, a vine disease that wiped out the European wine world for a couple of decades. They brought all those grapes and they were all planted in Argentina, and Malbec seemed to do especially well. And today is the dominant grape in Argentina. So the question always comes up, why is one of these a blend and why is the other monovarietal or all one grape? And there are so many reasons for that. Part of it has to do with the fact that Bordeaux, like most great European wine regions, is a marginal place for growing grapes and ripening them to the level for making good wines. So Bordeaux doesn't, or historically before climate change, really didn't every year get all of its grapes right. And it also had problems. Some years, if the spring had a frost that came late, it could damage the grapes and the vines, and you wouldn't get any grapes at all. Some years it would rain right when you would normally pick, and the grapes will all swell and rot, and you don't get any good grapes at all. So in Bordeaux, the tradition developed of planting different kinds of grapes in the same field. Some of them budded early and ripened early, so you could harvest them before it rained. Some of them bud out late, so if there was a frost, they would miss it and still could ripen in the fall and give you wine that way. So you had different grapes to sort of hedge as insurance against different climate situations. Also, it meant that if your grapes didn't ripen all the way and your Cabernet Sauvignon was really, really astringent, you could put in some Merlot, which was rounder and softer, and try to balance everything out. So Bordeaux is multiple grapes because that's what made sense to grow and make consistently commercial amounts of wine of good quality over the centuries. Today, with climate change, the truth is you could probably make a really good 100% Cabernet Sauvignon in Bordeaux most years, but then it wouldn't be Bordeaux. The Malbec is in a different situation, and it has to do both with the climate of the New World and sort of wine marketing in the New World. In the early 20th century, through the early 20th century, European wines were almost always named from where they were from. So Bordeaux is from Bordeaux, and Burgundy is from Burgundy, and Chianti is from Chianti and Tuscany, Italy. So people didn't actually know, drinkers didn't know what grapes were in those wines. They just knew that Bordeaux tasted like this and Burgundy like that, and every other region just tasted like what the wines were without really knowing what was in the grapes. When people started making wine in the New World, especially California and Australia in the 19th century, they would make a wine and they had to decide what to call it. And you really couldn't call something in 1880 Napa because nobody even knew where Napa was or what the wine would taste like. So when people in the New World in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century made a wine, they tasted it and said, well, this kind of reminds me of Bordeaux. And they would call it claret, which is just English slang for Bordeaux. Or this kind of tastes like Burgundy, so they would call it Burgundy. They would just put the name of the French region on the label and use that to signal to people what to expect. The most famous example of that for those of us of a certain age, you can remember back to the day, Gallo Chablis. Right? Everybody, well, not everybody, but I think many of us will remember Gallo Chablis. It is not Chablis. Chablis is 100% Chardonnay grown in the Chablis region of Burgundy, France. Gallo Chablis was a blend of Chenin Blanc and French Colombard grown in California's Central Valley. So nothing to do with each other, but both Gallo Chablis and what people thought of as Chablis in the 60s and 70s were crisp, neutral, not very fruity. So by calling it Chablis, Gallo kind of gave you an idea about what to expect. Now, by the 1990s, for a lot of reasons, that changed. Some of them have to do with American winemakers looking for better quality and realizing some grapes made better wine and starting to put the grapes on the label to signal that. Some of it had to do with a multi-decade campaign by the EU to get Americans and Australians to stop using European wine names on American and Australian wines. So by the 1990s, we named grapes in the named wines in the United States and in the New World after the main grape in the blend overwhelmingly. So we began to see Cabernet Sauvignon, and we began to see Merlot, and we began to see Pinot Noir, and we began to see Malbec. The 1990s are when Argentina starts really its commercial wine industry. And so Malbec was the grape that did best. They would make wine with mainly Malbec, and they would call it Malbec. Now, actually, most Malbec you find in the market is 100% Malbec. So why don't they blend like they do in Bordeaux or in Chianti or other places? The reason is simple. Argentina is a really reliable place to grow grapes. Most New World vineyards are in places that do reliably ripen fruit year after year. So you don't need the insurance policy against frost and late season rains, and you don't need to have the other grapes to kind of fill the wine out. So most New World wines are, I'd say, overwhelmingly labeled with the name of the grape and are between 75 and 100% that grape, where many European wine regions are really based on blending different grapes and carry the name of their region, not of the grape that's on that. All right, that's enough history. And by now, I think you probably had a chance to fully taste both of these wines, figure out which one you like. So let's talk about fruitiness. All right, so which is fruitier? And by fruitier, all we mean is that the degree to which what you taste in the wine is fruit, as opposed to any of the other things you taste. And I think in this period, it's really easy, right? It's the Andaluna Malbec races is all about fruit. It is what we would call explosively fruity. And there's really not much else happening in the wine other than those fruit flavors, except maybe a little bit of spice or maybe a little teeny bit of mocha. But I mean, it's really mainly about that sort of raspberry, boysenberry, blackberry kind of flavor. In contrast, the Bordeaux has a lot of things happening in it that mean the fruit isn't as far forward or isn't as obvious in the flavors. And in fact, if we're going to call it something, if the Malbec is fruity, then we might call the Bordeaux savory, because the flavors that you get in it are often not sweet flavors at all. Like you get a little bit of a herby, tobacco-y thing, and you also get a very characteristic of Bordeaux flavor that you might have heard people call lead pencil. Basically, something that reminds you of graphite. If you've ever put a pencil in your mouth and sucked on the lead, you would know what that flavor was like. Very traditional sort of flavors here. So the Andaluna is more fruity. The Bordeaux is more savory. And if you liked one versus the other, that may be a characteristic you really like. Okay, so let's talk about oak levels in these two wines. You've tasted both of them, and so you have an idea maybe which one has more oak. But before we talk about that, let's just talk about what the whole oak thing is all about. It is helpful to remember that before the mid-20th century, almost all wine in the world was made in some kind of a wood vessel, and almost all of it was oak. So using oak is not a new thing, it's an old thing. Really, when wine production moved out of the Greek and Roman area where they used clay pots called amphora, people looked for something to put wine in, and barrels made from wood were the best thing they had, and oak turned out to be the wood type that worked best for wine. So why is oak important in wine? Well, it does two different things. The first thing that aging a wine or putting a wine in an oak barrel does is it exposes the wine to oxygen. So barrels are not airtight, both at the seams of the staves, but also through the wood itself. So when you put a wine in an oak barrel, there's a little bit of air coming in through the wood and a little bit of wine evaporating out through the wood all the time. Now, when air and oxygen gets into wine, it causes a whole range of chemical changes. One of those changes is that the fruit flavors in wine are actually very vulnerable to oxidation, to having oxygen kind of combine with them and make them go away. So when wines sit in barrel, they become less fruity. And as they become less fruity, you have the ability to taste other things that are in the wine other than just pure fruit. So part of barrel aging is about sort of tamping down the fruit and letting other things express. The other change that happens when air gets into wine through the barrel is got a fancy name of polymerization of phenolics. Basically what happens in a red wine in particular, there are going to be these chains of proteins. Some of them will be tannins and some will be pigments. As oxygen gets into the wine, those chains hook up with each other and they become too big to keep floating in the wine, and they begin precipitating out as sediment on the bottom of the barrel. So as wine ages in a barrel, it lightens in color, but it also becomes smoother and rounder and more supple as those tannins precipitate out. So one of the reasons we put wine in a barrel is to dampen the fruit. Another is to soften it or give it a bigger sense of roundness. There's a second impact of barrels, which is about flavor. So if you think about the wood the oak wood, oak has a lot of stuff in it, including some sugar. It also has vanillin and other flavor compounds like cedary stuff and herbal stuff. So if I make a barrel out of oak and I put wine in it, it's going to soak some of those flavors out of the wood. If I put that barrel over top of a fire and I char it, which is usually what I do to cure the inside, I will caramelize some of those sugars, and now I'm going to start adding caramel flavors and smoky flavors and ashy flavors. All of that stuff can also come out of the barrel. The first time we use a barrel when it's brand new, there's a lot of that flavor, and the grain of the oak is still fairly loose, so more air comes in. The second time, the wood's a little tighter because it's swelled from the liquid, and some of the flavor has come out of the wine. The third time, there's less flavor. The fourth time, less. And by the fifth time we get to using a barrel, there's really not any flavor exchange happening anymore. So we call a fifth use and beyond barrel a neutral barrel. So if you've ever heard about a wine aged in neutral oak, it just means it's a barrel that didn't add much flavor, much of any flavor to the wine, and the air exchange was really, really slow. Until the mid-20th century, basically almost all wine would have been made in neutral barrels. And the simple reason was that nobody bought a barrel until an old one wore out. And since a barrel can easily last 10, 12 years if you take care of it, there wasn't a lot of new oak in most wineries. In the mid-20th century, people began being more aware and increasingly focusing on making especially red wines that were more generous and easy to drink when they were young. So getting more air into the wine when it was aging was helpful in softening it up so it'd be more appealing. And you begin to see people buying barrels on purpose to make wine and using them once or twice and then selling them and buying new ones. When people were using oak that way to sort of soften the wine, the flavor of the oak was something they tolerated. What they learned was, though, a lot of people like how oak flavor works in wine. And so as we've gone through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and today, sometimes you put a wine in barrel in order to get the oak flavor into it because that's what people want to taste. Unless you're working on the cheap. Now, if you're really cheap and you can't afford barrels and to do all the work with it, you could make your wine in a stainless steel tank and you could dump oak staves into it, or you can even buy bags of pre-toasted standardized ground oak flour and pour into your wine so it will taste oaky. We try not to buy wines like that because there's something just a little bit gross about that. Anyway, when you taste these two wines, I think, which one do you find oakier? I think a lot of people are going to find the Andaluna Malbec a little oakier, even though it's never seen any oak at all, because the Andaluna does have that little light mocha flavor that people associate with barrel. In contrast, the Bordeaux actually spent half of the Bordeaux spent 12 months in barrel, and you'll taste that in that herbaceousness that's there and the little bit of smokiness that you won't find in the Andaluna. All right, I need to get moving a little bit here. So let's talk about tannins just a little bit. Which of the two wines are tannic? So tannin is found mainly, those phenolics we were talking about in the seeds and the skins, a lot of those are tannin. And tannin is a protectant and it can cure things. If you think about tanning leather, you do that by soaking oak to extract the tannin and then putting the leather in it, or at least traditionally that's how it was done. When you taste these two wines, which one is more tannic seems to be really easy. And if you have any doubts, just take the Bordeaux and really swish it around in the front of your mouth and just wait a second and you can literally feel the tannins climbing up your gums as they come forward. The tannins give the wine a mouth-watering character. So wines with ripe tannins like these have a more mouth-watering feel to them. They often pair with richer foods better and they last longer because, again, tannins are a preservative. Wines lower in tannin are smoother, gentler, easier to drink by themselves. So if you prefer the Andaluna, that may be a sign that tannin is not your bag. And if you really prefer that gloriously drying feeling of the Bordeaux, could be that tannin is something you don't mind or even really like. All right, I'm almost out of time. So let's just talk about one last thing, which is complexity. You hear wine people talk about that all the time. Complexity merely means how much is going on in the wine, how many different things are happening. And between these two wines, again, I think it's pretty obvious, the Andaluna is the less complex of the two. Again, it's about fruit and a few other things. As you taste the Bordeaux, really with every taste, you can notice a little something different. There's a little something over here and a little something over there. There's the fruit, there's the way things move around in your mouth because you're salivating. All of those things make the Bordeaux more complex. That doesn't mean it makes it a better wine for you. Some people like a wine that's just easy to drink and it tastes good and they're done with it, and that's perfectly fine. And some people really enjoy spending time with wine and noticing something new every time they take a sip, and more complex wines give that. So those are the 4 dynamics I had for the red wines, and hopefully they helped you understand a little bit more about what you like there.
Thank you, Doug. Okay, so the first question we have is about decanting. You didn't ask
Yes.
us to decant either of these. So what does decanting a wine accomplish and when should you do it?
Well, the first thing decanting accomplishes is it puts a wine in a really pretty glass container on your table that looks really good in the candlelight, right? So that's the number one thing decanting does. Two reasons to decant a wine. If you have an older red wine, that process of the tannins and the pigments combining with each other and falling out happens in the bottle, and you can have sediment in the wine. The sediment won't hurt you, but it's kind of gross and it doesn't feel very good. So one reason we decant wine is to pour the clear wine off the sediment so that we don't have that gritty, dark stuff in our wine. So that's sort of the traditional main reason for decanting. The second reason that you decant wine is when you pour the wine into the decanter, especially if you do what's called splash decanting, where you just hold it up and glug, 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 you're mixing oxygen in with the wine, and you're also getting rid of any dissolved carbon dioxide that might be in the wine left over from fermentation. The carbon dioxide going away makes the wine feel a little softer. The oxygen in the wine will start the process of oxidation. In a barrel where that oxidation happens slowly, it will make the tannin soften. That doesn't actually happen in a decanter over an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. Sorry, wines don't get softer in decanter. What they do is they change and they taste different as they have more air. And often with a young red wine, because of those changes, because the fruit dies down a little bit, other stuff comes out and you say, oh, that wine is more open. The problem is that every wine behaves differently when it's decanted and everyone has different preferences. So my advice about decanting wines that you don't know, sort of the first time you're having it, is open the wine, taste the wine. If you like it, stop and drink it. If you think, I wish there was something different happening in this wine, or maybe there's something more there, then decant it and see what happens once you get it some air. If you want to get really out there, there are food scientists that will say the best way to decant a wine is to pour it into a blender and pulse it for 30 seconds, which really mixes everything up. But the big thing that does is it gets oxygen, it gets the carbon dioxide out of the wine, and sometimes carbon dioxide will make the wine feel astringent. So getting it out can help.
That is such great practical advice. The next question is about aging. Should either of these wines be aged?
The Andaluna, absolutely not. The Andaluna I would drink in the next 24 months, 100% slam dunk. The fruit is what there is. As wines age, all wines will lose their fruit character. In some that reveals other things or new flavors can develop that are interesting. But the whole point of the Andaluna is all that wonderful fruit. So I would drink the Andaluna right out of the gate. The Bordeaux, to be perfectly honest, is probably 5 years away from being where many people would say perfectly where they wanted it. The tannins are going to resolve a little bit, and over the next 4 or 5 years, some new flavors are going to come forward. It'll get a little more graphite-y and a little more herbal. And if that's what you like, you'll like the Bordeaux even better in 5 years. Over 5 years after that, it's going to start to develop what you might call tertiary flavors. So you're going to start getting things like forest floor and damp leaves and cured tobacco. And if that's your bag, you'll like it in that window. And there's enough tannin and acid in the wine that it will hang on for a while after that without starting to dry out and becoming really gross. But the biggest issue about aging wine is how much you like old wine. I mean, I have actually learned personally, having tasted a reasonable amount of older wine, I like wine pretty young. Now, there are wines that I buy that I always hold for 10 to 15 years. Barolo, I love Barolo. And if you buy Barolo, you sit on it for a decade because when you drink it sooner, you're sorry you did. But more and more, I'm looking for wines when they get into the window and I start liking them, I go ahead and finish them up. I've been more disappointed by drinking wines too old than I have too young.
Interesting. Yeah, older is not necessarily better, I guess.
Nope.
Okay, here's an interesting one we got. Somebody said that when they were in Europe last year, they drank great wine at every meal. They never got a headache. They were never hungover the next day. And they were told that it's because wine in Europe doesn't have sulfites and that they have to add sulfites to wine for it to be exported. What's the deal there?
That is this, yes, I'm sure somebody did tell you that. And I'm sure they were told that. We get this one all the time. People come back in and they say, hey, I was at this restaurant and I drank this €2 bottle of wine and we had 2 of them at lunch and then we just felt great and we had 4 more at dinner and everything was wonderful. So first thing to know, it is not a sulfite issue. No European winemaker makes one cuvee with one level of sulfur in it in Europe and then another one for export. And anyone who's told you that happens is making it up. It's a non-true statement. Sulfites, on top of that, sulfites actually don't cause problems for the vast majority of people. And if you think sulfites do cause you problems, do me one favor. Go buy a dried apricot and eat it. If eating a dried apricot does not give you a headache or make you sick, then you can drink a whole bottle of wine because there is less sulfite in a whole bottle of wine than there is in one dried apricot. Sulfite, there's a small percentage of the population for whom sulfite is very serious, but for most people, sulfite is just not relevant. You know what those wines, those €3 and €2 wines you were drinking in Europe really had going for them? They were cheap wine, which meant they were grown at very high yields and they were picked when they would produce the most wine. And their alcohol levels were probably about 11.5%. So you drank that whole bottle at lunch and it didn't bother you because it had a lot less alcohol than the 15.5% Zinfandel you drank for dinner here in the United States. It's pure alcohol consumption. Plus, you're relaxed, you had a 2-hour lunch, you know, the sun was beautiful, you drank 2 bottles of Pellegrino. I mean, that's really what's going on in those things.
Just a little vacation, extra vacation glow.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. A little away from specifics about wine, what's something that you found the most surprising about working in the wine business?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I've been in the business for almost 15 years now, having come to it from consulting in a world that had nothing to do with it. I would say by far the most stunning thing to me about being in the wine business and being able to taste, you know, 3,000 wines a year, something like that, is how much genuinely terrible wine there is in the world. How much just appallingly terrible. Why would anyone put this in a bottle and sell it? And do they let their mother drink it? I can't believe they really do. Most wine just isn't very good, even though today we live in a world where the average quality wine is higher than it's ever been in history. I mean, the wines are mostly clean. They're mostly not bacterial. They're mostly made with reasonably ripe fruit. But most wine just isn't really very satisfying when you pay attention to it, which is, you know, why in a shop like this, you know, we'll taste, I don't know, 15, 20 wines for every wine that we mark open to buy, not actually buy, but just say, oh, well, we could buy that if we wanted to. And it just continues to be shocking to me every day that I taste how much terrible, terrible wine there is in the world.
Okay, so since you've been talking about how people can figure out what kinds of wine they like to drink, what do you really love to drink when you're at home and just having a simple dinner at home? What's your go-to wine?
You know, it's so funny how you got to ask this question like every 18 months, you know, because I find my palate changes a lot. And I have, if I look back over the last 30 years that I've been drinking wine, you know, the stuff that's really in my wheelhouse is different, like every 1.5 or 2 years as kind of my palate changes and what I'm after in wine changes. I can remember when I drank a ton of Sangiovese of different kinds and Brunello. And I can remember when we drank a fair amount of American Cabernet Sauvignon. These days, I drink wines that are fairly direct and fairly high in acid and that go with almost anything that my family ever eats, because when I go home, I just want to open a box and pull something out and open it and not think about it. In the past year, I've drunk more, this is a wine geek answer. I've drunk more Mencia in the past 1.5 years than any other grape in the world. Mencia is a grape you find in Galicia, Spain, and in the area of Bierzo, right on the border. And I'm just really jonesing for Mencia these days. But when things are special, when we're doing a special occasion, we open Barolo.
Yeah. Okay, we just got a question. The wines we got today, or I guess wines in general, how should folks store them? At what temperature? Things like that.
Cool. Let's talk about, we'll do the long-term storage, then we'll do the open bottle thing. Okay. Long-term storage, the two important things are not in light. So you don't want sunlight on the wine because sunlight will actually damage the wine. That's why the wine tends to come in dark bottles, is to protect it. So out of the sun and at a stable temperature, 75 degrees or lower. So the big issue is above 75 degrees, we begin to get some interactions in wine that will cause them to decay and add cooked wine flavors. So you want to keep it under 75, and you want them stable, especially if you're holding them for a long time, because as wine ages, a cork finished wine at least ages, the cork becomes less elastic, but the glass always expands and contracts at the same rate. So if you have a 10-year-old wine in a room that goes from 55 to 75 in a day, the glass will expand, but the cork may not keep up. And if the cork doesn't stay tight against the glass, then air gets in, wine gets out, and now things are being damaged. So steady is the most important thing. In general, for long-term storage, the classic temperature is 54 degrees. And that classic temperature is because European cellars are naturally at 54 degrees, and we know wine lasts a long time when it's stored there. So something in the mid 50s and 60s is wonderful. But before I got into business, I had 200 bottles of wine, and I kept them in a closet in my basement in boxes on their sides. And I just piled lots of quilts up on top of them, so the temperature couldn't change very fast when it changed. And a lot of those wines drank great at 12 and 13 years. So coolish, stable, out of the light. Once you open wine, things are happening, right? So these wines are all open, and now there's a headspace, so there's air in there, and now the air is starting to interact with the wine, and we're getting oxidation. I want you to think about cutting an apple in half and leaving a half of the apple on a counter and putting the other half in the refrigerator, and coming back an hour later, which is going to be more brown? It's going to be the one on the counter, because cold slows down oxidation. So the number one thing you can do to preserve an open bottle of wine is, when you're done with it, put a stopper on it or the cork back in it and put it in the refrigerator. And yes, red wines too. All wine is better kept in the fridge if you're storing it overnight. Now, there's a problem. If you've kept it in the refrigerator, the next day you want to drink it, it's too cold. Red wine doesn't taste good when it's really cold, because those tannins are just like, so you need to warm it up. And what I do at home when I'm paying attention on top of things is I'll take the wine out, and I'll take up a big plastic measuring cup, and I fill it halfway full with kind of 75-ish degree water. And I just put the bottle in the measuring cup, and 10 minutes later, it's perfect. If I'm just having one glass and I'm not paying attention, I pour it into a glass measuring cup, and I microwave it in 3-second increments until it's the right temperature. And if it gets too warm, I pull a little bit of the cold wine into it and just bring it back down to temperature. Heating wine is bad for wine. But it's only really bad for wine if you're going to age it for a long time. That's where heat really does its damage. And the wine is open, and I'm drinking it tonight. So if it gets a little warm, the world is not going to come to an end.
It's really good to know. I would not have guessed.
The best thing you could, if you really want to hold a wine for a long time, though, the best thing to do is, when you open the wine, pour out what you're going to drink that night into a decanter or a measuring cup or whatever, and immediately put it in the refrigerator so that it gets cold faster. It's better to refrigerate it immediately than it is after a 2-hour dinner. That'd be the only other thing I'd add.
Okay, excellent. All right, one more really quick question to end us off. What would you think is the hardest food to pair wine with?
Oh, that is like the easiest thing in the known universe. Asparagus.
Really?
Asparagus. Asparagus has a chemical compound in it that makes most wine taste metallic. If you've ever tried to drink oaked Chardonnay and asparagus, it's one of the world's most disgusting pairings. I mean, the Chardonnay turns like tin foil on your teeth. Asparagus is super, super hard to pair. And there are really only 2 great matches for it. In Austria, they love asparagus. They have festivals for asparagus, and they make wine out of a grape called Gruner Veltliner. And Gruner Veltliner and asparagus, marriage made in heaven. The other thing that works with asparagus and every other difficult wine match in the world is champagne. Champagne goes with everything, and if it doesn't go with it, you won't care.
That's always if I don't know what wine to order, I just order champagne and everything's
exactly
okay.
Right.
Well, I'm really sad to say that we're out of time. I think we could have gone on for another hour at least. Thank you so much, Doug, for this amazing, educational, entertaining evening. And thank all of you who joined us from home. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know we had a great crowd of, I think, at least 80 people coming in. So great event. I'll just say again, Doug House is the owner and founder, along with his wife, of Chainbridge Cellars right here in McLean. We hope that you'll visit them often. And you can get more information about them and their wines at www.cbcwine.com. And once again, thank you all for joining us. We hope that we'll see you again for more wine tastings throughout the winter, as well as at the McLean Holiday Arts and Crafts Festival. That's on December 5th and 6th, and every other McLean Community Center event that's coming up. You can get more information about all of those upcoming events at mcleancenter.org/special-events. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.